Good morning from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, the editor of Spaceflight Now. Welcome to our live coverage for another launch of a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket carrying another batch of Starlink internet satellites into orbit. The target launch time is now 1 hour away at 9:56 a.m. Eastern Time, 13:56 UTC. For this mission, which is designated Starlink 5-12. That's the mission name in SpaceX's launch manifest. And the payload, as I said, is 56 Starlink internet satellites. Those satellites are buttoned up inside the nose cone of the Falcon 9 rocket, standing nearly 230 feet tall out on pad 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. Our camera location and my location, it's about 4 miles away from the pad, looking off to the east. As you can see, there is some cloud cover over the Space Center this morning, and the weather conditions appear to be iffy and quite uncertain whether those conditions will be acceptable for launch at 9:56 a.m. We haven't heard any official weather outlook on this for this countdown, for this launch attempt this morning. That's a bit unusual, but just based on the situation at hand, looking at the cloud cover and the radar picture, there is a line of thunderstorms just off to the north of the Space Center. Those thunderstorms individually are kind of trending off to the northeast, but there's a line of those cells that is kind of moving very slowly toward the south and toward the launch base here at Cape Canaveral, Florida. It's not currently raining, but the cloud cover has thickened and increased in coverage over the last couple of hours. This mission will mark the 44th SpaceX launch of the year. That includes Falcon 9 missions, Falcon Heavy missions, as well as the debut test flight of the Starship and Super Heavy booster back in April. So this, including all those missions, this will mark the 44th SpaceX launch of the year and the final planned launch by SpaceX in the first half of 2023. So they'll close out the first half of the year with 44 missions. That's on a pace for 88 missions this year if they maintain the same cadence in the second half of the year. About half of those missions have been dedicated flights for the Starlink network. SpaceX has launched more than 4,600 Starlink satellites on a number of missions. In fact, this launch will be the 90th SpaceX launch primarily dedicated to hauling satellites into orbit for the Starlink network, which provides low latency, high-speed broadband internet to consumers around the world. Each of these missions, according to SpaceX, adds about a terabit per second of throughput to that network. This will be SpaceX's second launch in as many days. Just yesterday, a little more than 24 hours ago, SpaceX launched a Falcon 9 rocket from out in Vandenberg Space Force Base, California, with 47 Starlink satellites on board. 56 are ready to go to space this morning from Florida. We'll be standing by and we'll pass along any updates we receive from SpaceX over the course of the next few minutes. A big milestone in the countdown will be coming up in about 20 minutes or so, when they will have to determine, SpaceX launch team will have to determine whether they're going to proceed into the final automated countdown sequence and whether they're going to start loading propellants into the Falcon 9. Once that happens, once these densified kerosene and liquid oxygen propellants start loading into the vehicle, and just pass along an update. We just got an update from SpaceX that the new target launch time has been pushed back to the backup time this morning. Not entirely unexpected, not surprising. That backup time is 11:35 a.m. Eastern Time, 15:35 UTC. And the official weather forecast, according to SpaceX, for that launch opportunity, now 2.5 hours away, is a 40% chance of favorable weather for launch. So SpaceX will forego the first of two launch opportunities this morning at 9:56 a.m. Now the countdown will be reset for 11:35 a.m. Eastern Time in hopes that the weather conditions improve. So with that delay to the new target launch time of 11:35 a.m. Eastern Time, we're going to continue streaming these live views of the Falcon 9 on Pad 40, but we will pause commentary for the next hour and a half or so and pick up again maybe around 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time as preparations pick up for the start of propellant loading, which would start at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Again, the new target launch time for the Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral, Florida is 11:35 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 15:35 UTC. Good morning again from NASA's Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm Stephen Clark, the editor of Spaceflight Now, resuming our live commentary for the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket with 56 more Starlink internet satellites on board. Liftoff is now an hour and 5 minutes away. The new target launch time, if you didn't hear our update earlier, has been set for 11:35 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 15:35 UTC. That's a delay of more than an hour and a half from the first launch opportunity this morning, which was a little before 10 a.m. Eastern. SpaceX's launch team decided to forego that opportunity due to some cloud cover and storms that were in the vicinity of the launch site here in Florida. The weather has trended in the right direction over the last hour and a half. The thunderstorms that were just north of the Space Center have weakened a bit and moved farther away. The radar shows some thunderstorm activity south of Orlando that may be tracking toward the Cape over the next hour or two. So the weather team and the SpaceX launch team will be monitoring that, as well as the cloud cover over the Space Center and over the launch pad at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. There are constraints for launch that have to do with the thickness of the clouds over the launch site and in the flight path of the rocket. Depending on the thickness of the clouds, the height of the clouds, and where the freezing layer is in the atmosphere on any given day, all those factors go into the criteria for the so-called thick cloud rule. That's in place to ensure that the rocket doesn't fly through any cloud cover that could have an electrical charge that could be triggered by the launch vehicle as it climbs through the atmosphere and trigger a lightning hit on the rocket. So those conditions are being monitored closely by the launch weather officer from the 45th Weather Squadron of the Space Force. The launch weather officer and the SpaceX launch team will be convening in the next 20 minutes or so as the SpaceX launch team nears the pre-launch readiness pole. That's when the engineers at the Launch and Landing Control Center will register their readiness, go or no-go, for launch. And of course, alongside the technical parameters, the weather is another factor that has to be considered during that readiness poll. This mission will be delivering 56 more Starlink internet satellites into orbit. SpaceX has more than 4,600 Starlink satellites currently in space. Well, they've launched more than 4,600 satellites into the Starlink network, I should say. More than 4,200 of those are currently in orbit. The Starlink network provides a low latency broadband internet coverage around the world. SpaceX has more than 1 million subscribers to their internet service right now. The countdown is approaching the T-minus 1 hour point.
Launch trajectory and countdown net. Polling is complete, and we are go for propellant loading and launch. Reminder and abort instructions. For non-urgent no-go conditions, brief the CE or LD and they will approve aborting the countdown. For urgent issues affecting the safety of the operation, operators shall call hold on the countdown net. Launch control will abort the launch auto sequence immediately and proceed in the launch abort auto. Finally, at T-minus 10 seconds, launch control will be hands off and relying on automated abort criteria for the remainder of the count.
Vehicle tanks are venting for the start of propellant load.
SpaceX's launch team has given the go for propellant loading that should begin in about a minute or so.
The launch auto sequence has started.
And propellant loading is now beginning on the Falcon 9 rocket at Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. So SpaceX is now loading about 1 million pounds of rocket-grade kerosene known as rocket propellant 1 and cryogenic liquid oxygen into the Falcon 9 rocket. This propellant loading will take a little more than 30 minutes, and then at T-minus 2 minutes, just before launch, the propellants will be fully loaded into the Falcon 9. At that point, the fill and drain valves will be closed and secured for flight. Then the tanks will be pressurized in preparation for engine ignition at T-minus 3 seconds. So obviously with propellant loading underway, SpaceX's launch team gave a go for launch. So the team is targeting 11:35 a.m. Eastern Time, 15:35 UTC for this mission to deliver 56 more Starlink satellites into orbit. T-minus 30 minutes and counting. Now less than a half hour remaining until the liftoff of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral. You're looking live at the Falcon 9 vertical at Cape Canaveral. with 56 Starlink satellites on board. There's been a weather delay already this morning due to some thunderstorm activity and cloud cover around the spaceport. We haven't heard an official update from SpaceX on whether the weather conditions are go for launch at this moment, but clearly they have enough optimism to proceed into propellant loading. They, of course, will have the option to hold the countdown at any point, all the way up to the final seconds before liftoff if the weather conditions are not going to be acceptable. This is the last launch opportunity of the day. If the launch does not happen at 11:35 a.m. Eastern Time, the mission would be pushed back until Saturday morning. 24 minutes, 35 seconds and counting. This mission is known as Starlink 5-12 in SpaceX's mission manifest. Here's a look at what the satellites look like in launch configuration. This picture comes from a previous mission, but the appearance of the satellites is much the same. This mission is carrying a stack of 56 satellites. These spacecraft are flat packed, one on top of the other, and they're actually held down to the rocket and to the adapter that connects them to the rocket using 4 metallic retention rods. These retention rods will be jettisoned after the Falcon 9 reaches orbit. That allows the 56 Starlink satellites to fly free of the upper stage of the launch vehicle once it reaches the proper altitude and inclination. Again, this photo is a file photo from a previous mission showing the stack of Starlink satellites just before they were encapsulated into the payload fairing of the Falcon 9. Here are some of the key features of these Starlink satellites. There are 56 on board. Each of these weighs about 300 kilograms or 660 pounds. Once separated from the Falcon 9, each of these spacecraft will deploy a solar panel and activate krypton-fueled electric thrusters. At that time, after they complete some automated checks, they will begin orbit raising. They will be deployed in an orbit about 185 by 210 miles altitude, and will use their onboard propulsion to climb to 329 miles altitude. That's where they'll enter service at an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator. So these satellites are going into what's known as Group 5 of the Starlink fleet. There are a number of groups or shells at different orbital inclinations and altitudes that comprise the entire network for Starlink. This one is going into Shell 5. That's part of SpaceX's second generation Starlink network. At an inclination of 43 degrees to the equator, that means the satellites will have coverage between 43 degrees north and south latitude. There are other Starlink satellites in different orbital shells that cover a broader swath of the planet at higher latitudes. This mission will continue deploying the older generation Starlink version 1.5 satellites. SpaceX has already started deploying upgraded Starlink version 2 satellites, which you see on the right. Those launches began earlier this year. There have been a handful of those launches now already, with more to come as SpaceX transitions in the coming weeks from launching version 1.5 satellites, the older iteration of Starlink spacecraft design, to the upgraded Starlink version 2 Mini, which has 4 times the communications capacity as the older generation, older design satellites. And these new satellites are also much larger and heavier as well. In fact, the Falcon 9 can launch more than 50 Starlink version 1.5 satellites in one shot, and around 21 or 22 upgraded version 2 satellites. These upgraded version 2 satellites are known as the Starlink V2 Mini, but the Mini name doesn't really tell you that these satellites are larger, because the Mini refers to it's the miniature version of the full-size version 2 Starlink satellites, which will begin launching on the Starship rocket, SpaceX's much bigger launch vehicle, once it's ready for operational missions. We're now 20 minutes and 40 seconds from liftoff. Propellant loading is proceeding. You can see some of the frost and vapors starting to appear around the first stage of the Falcon 9 as that super cold liquid oxygen chilled down several hundred degrees below zero is pumped into the vehicle. We expect to see a vent of gaseous oxygen. We're now seeing that from the strongback. As propellant loading proceeds, this occurs as the kerosene tank, the RP-1 kerosene tank on stage 2 is filled.
RP-1 load is complete.
We just heard confirmation from SpaceX that the RP-1 load is complete on stage 2. So the upper stage has been filled with fuel, and what you're seeing now, this vent, is associated with the chill down of the liquid oxygen transfer line that leads from a ground storage tank up the strongback into the umbilical connection into the oxidizer tank on stage 2. This chill down proceeds the actual loading of liquid oxygen onto the upper stage of the Falcon 9, which will begin in about 3 minutes or so.
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
Liquid oxygen loading on the second stage of the Falcon 9 is now underway. Now 15 minutes, 22 seconds and counting. Today's mission will be the 32nd orbital launch attempt of the year from the Eastern Range. This is the Space Force range that oversees all launch operations from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station and from NASA's Kennedy Space Center. So this is launch number 32 of the year from launch pads here on Florida Space Coast. As you can see here from this graph, the trend in recent years has been up, 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 with SpaceX in blue here, responsible for the majority of the uptick in launch activity here in Florida. In fact, of the 31 launches so far this year, 29 have been SpaceX, 1 Relativity Space, and 1, the most recent one on Thursday morning, by United Launch Alliance. And this is the last launch of the first half of this year from Florida Space Coast and also for SpaceX. Out at pad 40, the Falcon 9 stands 229 feet tall, about 70 meters in height. The frost and ice accumulation on the first stage of the Falcon 9 is now becoming a little more apparent. You can see the frost level rising on that first stage as the liquid oxygen tank is filled up with cryogenic fluid. The liquid oxygen tank actually begins about a third of the way up the first stage booster. At the very bottom is the kerosene fuel tank, which is also being loaded at this time, but the kerosene is stored closer to room temperature, so it does not have the obvious sign of frost accumulation there. SpaceX's countdown is approaching T-minus 10 minutes. If you haven't done so yet, please hit the thumbs up or the like button on our YouTube stream. This helps us attract a larger audience for our live launch coverage. So again, if you haven't done so, please hit the thumbs up or the like button on our YouTube stream. The countdown just passed the T-minus 10 minute mark. 8 minutes, 43 seconds and counting. The next big milestone in the countdown will be the start of engine chill down on the first stage of the Falcon 9. That is due to begin at T-minus 7 minutes. If you want to support our coverage, you can contribute in the Super Chat. We want to thank those of you who have already done that, including SG. Thank you for your contribution. These contributions in Super Chat help us continue bringing you this live launch coverage from Cape Canaveral and Kennedy Space Center. This money goes toward funding new equipment, new camera gear, as well as keeping our team able to come out to the Cape for all of these launches. As the countdown approaches T-minus 7 minutes, let's take a look at the countdown timeline. Some of these events have already passed with the start of propellant loading at T-minus 35 minutes. But I'll bring your attention to T-minus 7 minutes. We just passed that point. That's the start of engine chill down.
Engine chill has started.
And SpaceX just confirmed engine chill is underway. This is the thermal conditioning of the engines, the 9 kerosene-fueled engines at the base of the first stage booster. These engines will be brought down to cryogenic temperature. This is done by flowing a small amount of liquid oxygen into the engine plumbing, into the engine compartment itself to bring the temperature down to the proper threshold to avoid the risk of damage from thermal shock as the cryogenic fluid flows into the engines at ignition. Also at this point in the countdown, checks of the Falcon 9's guidance system
RP1 load is complete on stage 1.
should be underway. And we just heard that the kerosene load on stage 1 is now complete. So 46,000 gallons of kerosene now aboard the Falcon 9. Liquid oxygen loading will continue until about T-minus 2 minutes, as you can see in this timeline. And then at 60 seconds prior to launch, control of the countdown will hand over from the ground computer to the Falcon 9's onboard flight computer, and that will oversee the final pressurization of the propellant tanks, as well as sending the engine start command at T-minus 3 seconds. At T0, if the engines are all healthy, the 4 hydraulic release clamps will open to allow the Falcon 9 to begin its climb into orbit. The Falcon 9, after liftoff, will be heading southeast from Cape Canaveral. This red line shows the approximate ground track just north of the Bahamas. The drone ship, just read the instructions, is in position there more than 400 miles or more than 600 kilometers downrange for landing of the first stage booster. It'll take about 65 minutes.
Pressing for strongback retract.
Or about an hour and 5 minutes from liftoff until separation of the 56 Starlink satellites. The upper stage will perform 2 burns to reach its target orbit on this mission. And the first stage will be landing on the drone ship. Just read the instructions about 8.5 minutes after liftoff. The next major milestone will be the retraction of the strongback.
Strongback retract has started.
And we just heard that call from SpaceX Launch Control that the retraction of the strongback is now getting underway. This mast is used to actually transport the rocket horizontally from the hangar out to pad 40, and then it's used to raise the rocket vertical on the pad when it is in the final stages of launch preparation. And now you can see the clamp rather, that reaches around the upper stage has opened to allow the strongback to recline about 1.5 degrees from the rocket. As you can see earlier, and in that shot from SpaceX at the pad, the payload fairings for this mission are reused from previous flights, as well as the first stage booster. 3.5 minutes now until liftoff. The first stage of the Falcon 9 is number B1069 in SpaceX's inventory. It's going for its 8th flight on this mission. It debuted back in 2021.
Stage 1 LOX load is complete.
Now 2.5 minutes from launch. You can clearly see the strung back has retracted fully. At liftoff, that strung back will swing even further away from the vehicle.
Stage 2 LOX load is complete.
And with that call, we've heard that the Falcon 9 is now fully loaded with 1 million pounds of propellant.
Ground gas closeouts.
In the final minute of the countdown, the Falcon 9's onboard computers will take control of the count. T-minus 1 minute.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
There we have confirmation that the Falcon 9's onboard computers have control. We're waiting for the launch director's final go.
Go for launch.
And there we have it. The launch director has given his final go for launch. T-minus 30 seconds. In the final seconds of the countdown, water will be dumped onto the launch pad. It should take about 25 seconds for the roar of the Merlin engines to reach our location. 15, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of the Falcon 9 carrying 56 Starlink satellites. And the Falcon 9 has cleared the launch towers. Falcon 9 is now pitching downrange. It's heading southeast from Cape Canaveral. Let's listen to the roar of those Merlin engines. Like the Falcon 9 is going through some cloud layers at the Space Center. Switch to SpaceX, which is now providing some onboard camera views. Falcon 9 has now passed the speed of sound as it climbs towards orbit. The Merlin engines will have throttled down and will now be re-throttling up. Now it has cleared max Q. We've had confirmation that it's reached max Q.
MVAC
Less than
chill
a
has
minute
started.
left in the burn of the first stage. We're hearing that the MVAC engine on the second stage is being thermally conditioned for ignition. Now 2 minutes into flight. Everything apparently going well on today's launch. We'll be coming up on main engine cutoff, shutdown of the first stage. This will be followed by stage separation and ignition of the upper stage. Jettison of the payload fairing will follow.
Main engine cutoff.
We have confirmation of main engine cutoff.
Stage separation confirmed.
And there we see stage separation and MVAC engine ignition.
MVAC startup.
On the
Fairing
left
separation
side of
confirmed.
your screen, you're seeing the first stage of the Falcon 9, and then on the right, the separation of the payload fairing. Get a first view of the Starlink satellites stacked inside the nose cone of the rocket. The Merlin vacuum engine nozzle glowing red as the Falcon 9 second stage passes an altitude of 100 kilometers. On the left, the first stage continues to climb as it reaches its apogee.
Hello again, this is Stephen Clark from Kennedy Space Center. I had to duck outside to operate the camera to track the vehicle as it climbed into the sky. It disappeared into some cloud cover.
Both vehicles are on a nominal trajectory.
About a minute or so after liftoff. And as you can see, the upper stage is continuing to fire into orbit, approaching a velocity of 6,000 miles an hour, about 10,000 kilometers per hour. Thanks to Stephen Young for commentary at liftoff and getting you through the first phase of the Starlink 5-12 mission. The first stage booster on the left-hand side of this split screen is beginning its descent back toward SpaceX's drone ship, a football field-sized vessel about 400 miles off the coast of Florida, northeast of the Bahamas. In fact, you can see some of the teal-blue waters of the Bahamas just off to the left of one of those grid fins that's unfurled on the first stage booster, looking nearly straight down 115 kilometers
of signal.
altitude above the surface of Earth.
Both vehicles continue to follow a nominal trajectory.
Both vehicles on nominal trajectories, according to SpaceX, and this map from SpaceX shows the location of Stage 1, flying just off the northeast coast of the Bahamas. Stage 2 is also northeast of the Bahamas, but accelerating and climbing into orbit. Stage 1, as you can see, is on that arc downrange, heading for the drone ship location. Now about 30 seconds away from the entry burn on the first stage. This will involve firing 3 of the 9 engines to begin decelerating the first stage booster as it dives into the atmosphere. You see 76 kilometers and descending now
Both
on
stages
stage
on a
1.
nominal trajectory.
Standing by for that entry burn.
Stage 1 FTS is safed.
Stage 1 entry burn startup.
Entry burn is underway. This will last a little more than 20 seconds. You can see the velocity now rapidly decelerating on the lower left thanks to this maneuver.
Stage 2 FTS is safed.
Stage 1 entry burn shut down.
Entry burn is now complete. The rocket will now coast, the first stage booster will now coast for about another 90 seconds before relighting its center engine for a final braking burn just before landing. Up in space on stage 2, everything looking good. That engine nozzle on the Merlin vacuum engine glowing red hot as expected, as the rocket is now
Both
about
vehicles following a nominal trajectory.
a minute and a half from entering orbit. So we expect to have two nearly simultaneous major milestones coming up at about 8.5 minutes after launch. That'll be the landing of the first stage and orbital insertion on stage 2 with the 56 Starlink satellites.
Stage 1 transonic.
First stage is now 600 miles per hour, 1,000 kilometers per hour, standing by for the ignition of the center engine for the final landing burn as it heads through the
Stage
stack of
2
clouds.
is in terminal guidance.
See some buffeting there as it heads deeper into the atmosphere, 2,000 meters altitude. There's the landing burn
Stage
underway.
1 landing burn.
Drone ship coming into view.
Landing lit deploy. Stage 1 landing confirmed.
Falcon 9 has arrived on the deck of the drone ship. Just read the
Expected loss of signal.
instructions.
Cape.
This is the eighth flight of this booster, number 1069 in SpaceX's fleet, the 203rd landing of a Falcon booster overall. And we've heard confirmation of shutdown of the upper stage engine, as expected.
Nominal park orbit insertion.
And that's an important call from launch control, nominal orbit insertion. So the 56 satellites, the Starlink payloads on board the Falcon 9 rocket, still attached to the upper stage, are now in a parking orbit, a very low orbit. And this vehicle will coast halfway around the world for about the next 45 minutes before relighting its engine just for about 3 seconds. Very short impulse that will
Expected
circularize
loss of signal. Bermuda.
its orbit about 200 miles or 300 kilometers in altitude. That will set up for deployment of the 56 Starlink satellites coming up at 65 minutes since launch. That will be at 12:40 p.m. Eastern Time, 1640 UTC. That's when SpaceX can declare success on this morning's launch. With Falcon 9 and 56 Starlink satellites now in parking orbit, coasting in space off the coast of South America. Let's take a look at some of the mission stats for this flight. This was the 235th launch of a Falcon 9 rocket overall since 2010, the 246th launch of SpaceX's Falcon rocket family, including Falcon 1, Falcon 9, and Falcon Heavy since 2006. This was the 8th launch and landing of this particular Falcon 9 first stage booster, 1069, the 197th SpaceX launch from Florida, and the 130th SpaceX launch from Space Launch Complex 40 at Cape Canaveral. This is SpaceX's most used launch facility and is the 185th launch overall from this launch pad, including the SpaceX missions as well as a number of Titan rockets that departed from this pad in its previous use for the Air Force's Titan rocket program dating back to 1965. This was the 175th flight of a reused Falcon booster, 203rd landing of a Falcon booster overall, and the 90th SpaceX launch primarily dedicated to deploying satellites for the Starlink internet network. That figure, 90 missions, dates back to May 2019. This was the 44th SpaceX launch of the year, number 41 for the Falcon 9, and the 32nd orbital launch attempt from Cape Canaveral so far this year. This was the final SpaceX launch of the first half of 2023, so you can see SpaceX is on pace for roughly 88 missions this year if they maintain their current cadence. Before we sign off, as we normally do, we want to look ahead at some of the launches over the next few days. The next launch will be on Tuesday when a Russian Soyuz rocket is set to lift off from the Vostochny Cosmodrome in the far east of Russia, carrying a Russian civilian weather satellite into polar orbit. And then a couple of Falcon 9 missions on tap for the first days of July. The next launch from here in Florida will be next Saturday, July the 1st. That'll be the liftoff of a Falcon 9 rocket carrying Euclid. That's a European Space Agency astronomy mission. This Euclid Space Telescope will be observing billions of galaxies across the universe to gather data and insights into the nature of dark energy. This mission will depart from the same launch site that we saw the launch today, Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral. One day later, on July 2nd, another Falcon 9 is set to lift off from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California with another batch of Starlink internet satellites to continue deploying satellites for the Starlink network. And then on July 4th, Independence Day, here in the United States, a European Ariane 5 rocket is set to launch from the Guyana Space Center in South America. This mission will be deploying a French military communications satellite called Syracuse 4B, as well as a German government experimental communications satellite called Heinrich Hertz. This mission will be notable because it's going to be the final flight of Europe's Ariane 5 rocket that has been a workhorse for European space programs as well as a numerous commercial satellites since 1996. The Ariane 5 has flown more than 100 times from the Guyana Space Center in South America, and this is the final flight before Arianespace and ESA transition to the new Ariane 6 rocket that will be scheduled to debut sometime in 2024. We'll leave you with one final look at Space Launch Complex 40. You can see the strong back has remained in its reclined position where it's been since liftoff of the Falcon 9, and then attention at Pad 40 in the coming days will turn to preparing the pad for the next Falcon 9 launch. That'll be a notable one next Saturday with an interesting mission, Euclid, the space telescope for the European Space Agency. We'll hope you'll join Spaceflight Now for coverage of the Euclid launch next week. Thanks for joining us for the launch of Starlink 5-12. Have a great weekend. Have a great week. This is Stephen Clark reporting live from Kennedy Space Center.